My name is Gina Midico with MnDOT and chair of this committee. I will now call the meeting to order. We have two items on the agenda today, so this will likely be a quick meeting. Both are information items. If nobody has any proposed changes or modifications to the agenda, we can approve that. I'll pause here to see if anyone has any suggestions. Okay, seeing none, the agenda is approved as presented. The next item is the adoption of the July, because we did not meet in August, July 10th meeting minutes. I do have one minor correction, Jed. I think when it says I called the meeting to order, it identifies my agency incorrectly with my old agency.
Ooh, yes, it does. So when someone moves to approve this, please request that it be approved as amended.
Okay. All right. I don't know the appropriate way to do that, but all right. It says, does anyone have any other changes, or would anyone like to make a motion?
Elaine Kutsukos will make a motion to approve the minutes as amended.
Okay, thanks, Elaine. Do I have a second?
This is Drew Flommer. I'll second it.
Okay, thanks, Drew. So we have a motion and a second. Any further modifications or discussion? Okay, hearing none. Please indicate your vote when Jed calls your name by roll. Thanks, Jed.
Jorge Bernal, Anoka County.
Aye.
Mark Culver, Brooklyn Park. Drew Flommer, Carver County.
Aye.
Charlie Howley, Chanhassen.
Aye.
Could you repeat that? Sorry, I missed you.
Aye.
Scott Peters, Dakota County. Okay. Dan Patterson, Hennepin County.
Aye.
Bridget Reef, Mac. Patrick Boylan, Community Development.
Aye.
Dave Burns, MTS.
Aye.
Patrick Haney, Metro Transit.
Aye.
Bria Fast, Minneapolis. Gina Midico, MnDOT.
Aye.
Innocent AO, Pollution Control Agency.
Aye, but Lauren Dickerson on his behalf.
Gotcha, thank you. Kevin Roggenbuck, Ramsey County. Anton Jervy, City of St. Paul.
Aye.
John Rudolph, Scott County. Sunita Kasushwa, Suburban Transit.
Aye.
Aline Katsukos, Tab Coordinator.
Aye.
Sarah Allen, Washington County.
Aye.
And Chris Hartzell, City of Woodbury.
Aye.
Chair, there were 14 ayes, no noes, and no abstentions.
All right, thanks, Jed. The next item on the agenda is public comment on committee business. So we'll just pause here and see if anyone is here to speak on committee business.
There were no people to sign up in advance.
Okay, thanks, Jed. Okay, moving on then, we will go to our first information item, which Steve Elmer has, and it is about the Regional Bicycle Transportation Network, the RBTN, and Regional Bicycle Barrier updates, RBB. And I think Steve has a presentation as well.
Yes, I do.
Great.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Let me share my screen here. And I think that's correct. Okay, so I will begin with a brief description of the regional bicycle barrier results for the update. And as you'll recall, we had an open period for agencies to propose changes to regional bicycle barriers, regional bicycle barrier crossing areas, and that was back in the month of May. We had So we received 3 requests for new regional bicycle barriers from Scott County. Each of these was a expressway regional barrier based on recent conversions to expressways in the county. And then we received 1 request to shift the location for a designated regional bike barrier crossing improvement area within the city of Medina. The purpose of this was to align better with a planned trail crossing grade separation project across Trunk Highway 55 in the city. And that amounted to about a 1/10 of a mile shift, so very, very minor. And so we evaluated these based on consistency with the definitions for regional bike barriers established at first with the regional bicycle barriers study, but also included in the transportation policy plan. And they all met the definitions. So all of these requests, all 4 of them, are recommended for approval. And that's all I have on regional bike barriers. So I'll just pause for a moment if there are any questions about regional bike barrier updates. Okay, so hearing none, we'll move on to the RBTN, Regional Bicycle Transportation Network. So I just wanted to give you a quick review of some of these measures that were applied through this process. And this will be a review. We did present these in detail to this committee back in early May, I believe. So the first of these measures is connectivity, and we're looking for new direct connections to regional bicycle barrier crossing locations, connections to state and or regional trails that are not already included on the RBTN, connections to local bicycle network access points, so basically connections of your local network to this RBTN addition, as well as new connections to adjacent cities and or county bicycle networks. So those 4 things were taken independently and then averaged. We graded these on an ordinal scale from 0 to 2, I believe, for this one. The next measure is corridor spacing. These are preferred minimum spacing distances between RBTN alignments or RBTN corridor center lines. These are also established in the transportation policy plan. They vary by the Imagine 2050 community designation type. As you can see here, for urban cities, urban edge cities, suburban or suburban edge, and then rural areas going from 1/2 mile to 2 miles for the preferred spacing. This was graded on an ordinal scale from -2 to +2. The next one is proximity to jobs and population. So this one is a 2-part one here. So the main measure is a forecast of total population plus jobs per square mile within a 1/2 mile buffer of that proposed alignment or corridor center line. These also vary by Imagine 2050 community designation. So these are targets that we graded based on how close they come to meeting that target, or if they meet the target. For urban cities, urban edge cities, and suburban cities, you see the target there. Population plus jobs per square mile. And then a variation on that measure was applied in a few cases where we have suburban edge communities connecting out to rural areas or through rural areas to other suburban edge communities or suburbs, where the majority of that distance of that connection runs through rural areas. And so this is an easier target to hit for those communities than the first measure. And this is a target of 800 population plus jobs forecast per linear mile. And so I believe we had 6 cases where this applied for the measure. And then in addition to that, we have the social economic equity measure. This is a qualitative measure. It was based on descriptions of agency self-assessments of the benefits to disadvantaged and vulnerable populations from improving RBTN access with the proposed change. And so we looked at including any access benefits to Black, Indigenous, people of color populations, people in poverty, areas of people in poverty, immigrant communities, people with physical disabilities, as well as youth and seniors. And for this one, I should just go back just since we have time. The proximity to jobs plus population, that was graded on an ordinal scale from -2 to +2. And then this qualitative measure was a scale of 0 to 2 for this one. We did also apply the directness measure in one case where we had competing and duplicating proposals. And so those are denoted in the footnotes to tables D and F in the attached PDF to this item. So now I'll give you kind of a summary of the results. We received 78 requests from 6 counties, 3 cities, and at least 5 regional park, regional trail implementing agencies. A few of those double as counties or cities. We had a few proposed corridors or alignments that we were divided into discrete segments for more balanced and fair assessments. And then we had 8 proposals that included very minor adjustments in the buffer areas for that alignment or corridor centerline location that would be typically addressed through an administrative adjustment. So all of those proposals are accepted and will be implemented as administrative adjustments. So those are shown and listed in table B in your handout attachment. In addition, we had 16 proposals that involved connections from the RBTN out to rural town centers or to other rural or out of region trails that are not on the RBTN. Those are listed in table C and as being deferred to our forthcoming RBTN rural connections analysis. That is part of our 2026 work plan. So we will begin that process in 2026. And we discussed these with those affected agencies, so they're aware of what's going on with that. And yeah. So in terms of so we had 58 update proposals. These are either alignment, corridor additions, or extensions that were reviewed and considered for approval in this process. And out of those, 48 proposals are recommended for approval. So these are shown in table D and they're sorted. That table is sorted by the percentage of total available points received. And I would just note that the cutoff for these staff recommended approvals was at 40%. So if you received 40% of the available points, 40% of the 8 points possible, you were recommended for approval outright. And then beyond that line, there were 6 proposals that fell below the 40% cutoff that were considered based on allowing exceptions to the preferred spacing guidelines. And so we looked at those because some of these, they scored well in the other criteria, the non-spacing criteria. And so the only reason they would not be accepted was due to spacing. So we looked if there were ways to make exceptions to those. So those were discussed in detail with the bike ped planning technical work group. And after that discussion, we are recommending those also be approved with those exceptions to the preferred spacing guidelines. So those are shown in table E. And so that brings our total to 54 of these proposals are recommended to be approved through this process. And that leaves us with 4 remaining proposals. These are shown in table F that are not recommended for approval. So that's kind of where we stand with that process. And then, whoops, I jumped ahead. After that, each of the 54 proposals recommended for approval were assigned to a RBTN Tier 1 or Tier 2 designation based on several considerations shown here. We looked at connections to and between existing RBTN route tiers. We looked at how, if there are improved connections to the designated regional destinations on the RBTN that include regional transit nodes. We looked at new connections to regional bicycle barrier crossings, and there could be one or several additional crossings provided, connections. And we also looked at the overall length of the route, as well as the continuity and connections across city and or county boundaries. So these tier assignments, just to note, are shown in the rightmost columns in tables D and E. And that includes the rationale for each of those tier designations. And so then, so that's it for the summary of the results. And our next steps would be to present these recommended changes on both the RBTN and regional bike barriers at TAC planning on October 8th as an action item. There'll probably be one action item together. And then present those actions to recommend or accept changes to the RBTN regional bike barriers at TAC and TAB in November to be included in the draft regional solicitation application packet that will be released for public comment following that TAB approval. So that's all I have, and I'm happy to, I'll turn it back to you, Madam Chair, for any considerations and questions if there are any.
Thanks, Steve. Do any members of the committee have questions or comments for Steve? Don't see any hands jumping up. Or do I? Did I hear somebody unmute? No. Steve, maybe I'll just ask a follow-up. I know you presented this to the bicycle and pedestrian working group. I don't know if that's the right acronym. If I got all the words in there, but was there a lot of discussion and debate at that committee with staff's recommendations? Were any kind of changes made, or does this reflect changes that that group made, or kind of how did that discussion go? I'm not as close to this anymore as I maybe used to be.
Right. Yeah, well, that's a good question. Thanks for your question. You know, they were interested, and we, you know, presented what these, we mainly discussed the 6 below the line. I mean, nobody had any comments about the ones that were accepted, no problems with that. So the 6 that we were considering for exceptions to the spacing, I did go into a little bit more detail on each of those. They sort of deferred to us in our judgment and being so close to the data and knowledge about that. There were a few questions here and there that were addressed, but they basically accepted what we were considering through that. And I just really, our purpose there was to verify that they agreed with, or at least, did not oppose adding those additional 6 proposals to the acceptance category.
Thanks. And for those that, how about was there a lot of discussion about the rural items that were deferred to the 26 study? Because that would not be done in time for this solicitation. So any projects there would be, they could still apply for regional solicitation, but probably only for the active transportation funds, not the, I forget what the new category is for regional bicycle facilities.
Right. Well, it wouldn't prevent them, Madam Chair, thank you. It wouldn't preclude them from applying to regional solicitation. They just wouldn't be on the RBTN, so that's a consideration. That's there'll be new scoring applied in this process, so I'm not sure how that's all going to unfold and be finalized, but that would go into it as well. So, but they understood the reasoning for deferring, and we've been talking about this rural centers connections analysis for next year for a while now, and they understood the wisdom in kind of waiting for that to consider those specific proposals.
Thanks. Any other questions or thoughts? All right, it sounds like you will be back next month for official. We have a 2-part process for this, so seeing it this time, and then next month we'll be back for approval. Is that correct?
Yes, correct.
All right. Thank you. Appreciate the preview, and we will see you again in October.
Thank you.
I'll get back to the agenda here. Thanks, Steve, for that. And also thanks to all the members. It looked like there are a lot of agencies that submitted applications. So that's helpful. And as we use the RBTN as a continuous tool, that folks are actively reviewing those corridors and revising as time goes on. So I know it can be a big lift for agencies. Go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, I just had one comment for the record. Really appreciated all the applications that came in. There were some, really good projects. They made sense. They filled gaps on the RBTN quite well. So we appreciate everyone's participation in that as well. Thank you for all those proposals.
Thanks, Steve. The next item on the agenda is another information item. And we have Tony Fisher and Siri Simons here to present, and this is on electric vehicle public charging, the electric vehicle public charging needs analysis. Tony, are you going to lead this, or Siri?
Thank you, Chair. I was going to pass it off to Siri Simons after just introducing the project.
All right.
So my name is Tony Fisher. I'm the project manager for the Met Council on the EV public charging needs analysis. And what we're doing with this project is really going out and collecting a lot of information, gathering some feedback from stakeholders, and looking at the needs for public charging in the Twin Cities, and then prioritizing those needs for the public sector, especially keeping in mind the regional solicitation potential for an EV charging category, and then the charging and fueling infrastructure grant award that we were given in early January and was put on hold in late January, but still a bit of hope out there for that. But yeah, with that, we have the benefit of Siri Simons and her team at HDR doing the work for us, and she's going to present today.
Thanks, Tony, and thank you, Chair, for the opportunity to present this information. I'm going to cover the objective of this project and the approach, which Tony started to get into already. I'll also share the timeline and then some of the pieces of information that we've gathered to date on this project, which is really still, it feels like getting started. We're getting into the swing of things. So I'll talk about the draft background information that we've collected so far, and then our approach to estimating charging needs and gaps. And given the light agenda, we may have some opportunity for discussion if people are interested in that. So like Tony mentioned, this is a planning level analysis of public electric vehicle charging needs for the region. The idea being that at the end of this process, we will understand the gaps in the regional EV charging network and where the public sector could fill those gaps. This is valuable overall for the region in terms of advancing EV adoption, but then also specifically when it comes to the regional solicitation, there will be a new category for EV charging infrastructure. And so this analysis could help support those applications that may be funded by CFI, depending on the future of that grant award, which is somewhat uncertain at the moment. And then additionally, we hope that the results of this analysis are valuable for local communities in the Twin Cities. There's quite a few cities that have their own climate action plans or even specifically EV adoption plans. And so our desire is that what we produce will be able to help them with siting infrastructure or attracting private entities to install infrastructure. So a couple of key focus areas of this work. I mentioned we're collecting background information, so I'll share some of that with you today. We also have a stakeholder component to this project. I'll talk a little bit about the timeline for that. That really is going to run throughout, so it's not one discrete task, but it kind of flows throughout the other areas of the work. We are going to be estimating charging needs first, and then determining where there is gaps, so where there is not infrastructure to meet those needs. And then we'll be prioritizing locations for siting chargers, and that information will be displayed on an interactive map that will be available to the public and also summarized in a report. In terms of the project timeline, we are moving swiftly. So started in July, have been collecting background information. We've started to do some stakeholder engagement in terms of meeting with utilities in the region, meeting with private stakeholders who either have EV charging stations or might be interested in installing EV charging stations. We are going to move into public engagement probably in the month of October. We'll be working with another consultant to do that engagement work. It will include things like attending pop-up events to share information about this project and gather feedback from the public, as well as some online opportunities for engagement and possibly other events like an open house. So that engagement will be happening starting in October, but probably running through January as the different pieces of this effort come together. We're starting to estimate charging needs and gaps right now. That will run until the fall. And then really in November, we'll start prioritizing locations for investment. That should be done by January. And we'll be, like I said, compiling that interactive mapping report with a goal to complete everything by April. So shifting into the background information that we've collected so far, one of our first tasks was to gather existing guidance on planning an electric vehicle charging network. So one of the key pieces of foundational information that we lay out in this background information is that when it comes to developing a complete charging network, there's a couple different types of charging that are important. So the first is DC fast chargers. These really support long distance travelers or people who are making quick stops, and they provide an experience that's much more like what you would have at a gas station. Community level 2 charging is also important, and this is something that's really valuable for people who maybe are dwelling at a location for a little bit longer. They are particularly useful in places like workplaces, shopping centers, near multifamily dwellings, things like that. Really, though, the majority of charging happens at home. So we know that 80% of electric vehicle chargers do charge at home, but there are some people who don't have access to charging at home. And for them, the public chargers are particularly important. The other thing that we don't spend a lot of time on in our analysis, but we recognize is important to a complete charging network is level 1 charging. So this is sometimes also called trickle charging. It's where you're plugging your car into an outlet. And in some cases, it can provide a low cost solution or sort of a top off opportunity for EV drivers. So that's really the complete EV charging network and what is included in it. And as we were looking at existing guidance, we found that the key to figuring out which of those charging types make sense really has to do with dwell time and land use. And so this example here is of an EV charging transect that is in a couple of different EV plans that we have found. Really the focus within this transect in the Twin Cities and this particular analysis will be on community charging and destination charging. So community charging is really for locations where you need to serve the nearby community, so high densities of multifamily residents or people who have limited access to charging at home. And then destination charging is kind of, as the name implies, more valuable in popular trip destinations. So this would be shopping centers, schools, restaurants, grocery stores, workplaces, things like that. And the power level in these different types of charging is really dependent on how long those dwell times are. So if people tend to be dwelling for a shorter time, a DC fast charger makes more sense. If people tend to be dwelling for a longer time, level 2 charging makes more sense. And that's a lot of what the guidance that we found really focused on. So we're putting together a memo for this project that provides more detail, but that's one of the foundational pieces of information when it comes to existing guidance. So I mentioned the importance of dwell times. The other thing that we've started to do is gather information about dwell times in the Twin Cities. So we started off by figuring out what source of data would make the most sense. We looked at the travel behavior inventory and at the small geographic levels that we're looking at in this analysis. The TBI didn't really give us the data at the granularity that we needed. So we ended up using replica data, which is provided from cell phone data, and it's aggregated into a travel simulation model. And then we applied a number of assumptions to figure out among the trips that we see in our replica data, which of those people would be looking for charging. So those assumptions are listed here. These are still under development. We've gotten feedback from both the project management team and the technical advisory committee on these. In general, we're assuming that multifamily residents are always looking for a charge. People who live in older homes are maybe also looking for a charge more often because they may not have EV infrastructure in their homes. And then people who rent may also be more likely to be looking for a charge because we know that sometimes people who own rental properties are not as able or willing to invest in charging infrastructure at those locations. We also assume that after 150 miles of driving, people are looking for a charge. And we're working on an assumption around income because we know that people with higher incomes tend to invest in home charging. So like I said, those are under development, but did want to share those with all of you and also share how the results are coming together. So you're looking at two different ways of reviewing the dwell time data. The map on the left is just the raw dwell time data, and then the map on the right is normalized. So we think that we can use these two types of analysis together to start to get some information about where and how much charging will be needed on the network. So we would use the normalized data to determine the number of chargers that are needed. We would use the raw data to prioritize locations. So just to go back to those maps that I was showing you before, our raw data tells us that there are areas of Sherburne and Wright County where there's quite a few dwell events, and so it may be worth prioritizing charging in those locations. When we look at the actual normalized data, there's not that many dwell events per acre, so maybe we're looking at installing 1 or 2 charging stations in those locations, but just wanted to provide an example of how we're using this dwell time information at this point. So sort of shifting gears to another type of background data that we've collected, we, like I mentioned, have met with the utilities that are serving the Twin Cities MPO area. We've been talking about this effort, particularly because we know it's important to coordinate with utilities early on when it comes to siting EV charging infrastructure to mitigate any capacity issues with the electrical grid. So in general, I think they appreciated those conversations that we had with them. We were asking about if there's maps of utility capacity available that we could use in our analysis. And generally the answer was no, there's not kind of general information like that it's publicly available, but the utilities are willing to look at our analysis once we have potential locations. So I think that coordination will be really beneficial. We also had some discussion about specific types of charging infrastructure. One thing we were curious about was utility mounted chargers, which could provide some efficiencies when it comes to permitting and sort of managing installations with federal funds. However, utilities generally said that could be complex and they were not particularly interested. So that was a useful finding. And then we also had some discussion about whether we could site the chargers to manage load on the grid. And the feedback from utilities is that their preference was using time of use pricing to manage load on the grid. So we're still thinking about how to incorporate that finding into our analysis. There's potentially some opportunity for the Metropolitan Council to support education on time of use rates. There's also still some opportunity to think about siting and load management in our analysis. And then again, sort of shifting gears to another piece of background information that we collected and felt was important. We know that multifamily residents and people from historically disadvantaged communities have a little bit of a different need than the general population for EV charging. And so we wanted to lay out and understand the research in that area. What we found is that typically at-home charging is somewhat less important for people of color, according to some recent national and local surveys. We also heard that workplace charging is particularly attractive to Latino drivers, again, based on recent survey data, and that reduced cost is a top reason for people of color to adopt EVs. Additionally, personal safety is a concern for these groups more so than the general population, and extreme weather is a perceived barrier to charging vehicles. So what that means, we think, is that when we consider opportunities for charging station siting and design, we really need to be thinking about those things. How is this charging station supporting personal safety? Is there adequate lighting? Are there adequate safety measures like cameras, things like that? And also, is it protected from the elements? So the other side of this is multifamily residents. I think the conclusions here were maybe somewhat intuitive. Often multifamily residents do not have access to charging, and so they tend to make greater use of public chargers. There's also some research that shows when multifamily buildings have access to EV chargers, it's seen as an amenity, which can attract new residents. But then on the other hand, there's concerns about displacement. And so as we do our siting analysis, we want to take those different elements into account. So that was sort of the quick overview of what we've captured so far in terms of key background information that can help guide our analysis. Now shifting into our approach to estimating charging needs and gaps. So just to lay this out, the steps that we'll take are we will identify existing charging stations in the region. We've already started to do that using data from the Alternative Fuels Data Center, and Minnesota also has our own Evaluate MN dashboard that does a really nice job of providing up-to-date up-to-date information on where chargers are. We're looking at current dwell times. We're also going to be forecasting future EV demand for the region, and then matching charging types to land use, dwell times, and forecasted future demand. So you can kind of imagine how we'll be looking at, where are people traveling? What do we expect the EV demand to be in the future? Does current infrastructure meet that need? If not, that would be considered a gap. And then we can provide information about what number of chargers and what power level might be appropriate in that gap. So there's the identification of the gaps, but there's also some prioritization of how to fill those gaps. And for that, we turn to these draft priorities for the network. We took a look at the TPP and laid out the regional goals that are in the TPP. If you're very familiar with the TPP, you might notice that this is missing the 5th goal, which has to do with natural systems preservation. We didn't see as much of a tie between that and EV charging, so that's sort of omitted from this slide. But for each of the regional goals, we identified a priority for the charging network that is based on what we've seen in other regional and community EV plans. So just to walk you through those, the first regional goal is our region is equitable and inclusive. Priority for the network would be to prioritize charging for residents without access to home charging. So what we mean when we say a priority is that if we're looking at a map of all the gaps in the infrastructure, if we're prioritizing access for people with without chargers at home, maybe we're focusing on more of those locations near multifamily dwellings, just as an example. The second regional goal is our communities are healthy and safe. So one way we could turn this into a priority is supporting air quality improvements by citing chargers in locations with poor air quality scores, according to MPCA's MinRisks data. A third goal would be our region is dynamic and resilient. Related priority would be promoting redundancy in the network. So this would look like identifying locations where there is existing charging infrastructure, but we could add another charger, or we could add more ports, things like that. And then the last goal is we lead on addressing climate change. And there's 2 priorities that could be considered here. One is citing chargers in high traffic locations. The idea being that if it's in a highly trafficked location, it's more likely to get utilized and more likely to be reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And then the other priority would be considering geographic coverage. So this would look like making sure that there's chargers sort of equally spread throughout the Twin Cities region. And this has been shown to support greater EV adoption, because even though most of the charging happens at home, when people know that there's a charger or see a charger on their route, that can actually influence their decision to purchase an EV. So I am actually going to pause here and see, Madam Chair, if you would like to have some discussion on these priorities, or if you'd like to just complete the presentation and then stop for questions at the end. I have one more slide on our EV demand forecast.
Since it's only one more slide, why don't you go ahead and finish, and then we'll just take any questions, or if this is an area you want to focus on, we can specifically ask for discussion on this, but why don't you just go ahead and finish first?
That sounds great. So the other piece I mentioned is the EV demand forecast. So wanted to get this in front of you all as well. We have a couple of different scenarios for future electric vehicle demand. So just to walk through those, there's a high EV adoption scenario. This is based off of the state's statewide multimodal transportation plan, which sets a target for 60% of sales to be EVs by 2030. That's the top blue line that you see there. I will say that's an aspirational target, and related analyses that we've done, it doesn't look like we're going to reach that, but we could if we had game-changing policy in the state. The next line, sort of the dotted line, is the average of that high scenario and the low scenario. And our low scenario is actually an aggregate of 12 different EV forecasts developed by different nonprofit, academic, and industry groups. And then the lower line, that red line, is an artificial slowing scenario. And we created that because those 12 different forecasts that I mentioned have not been updated in the last year to reflect our current political reality and some of the rollbacks that we've seen at the federal level in support for electric vehicles. So that red line is being updated instead of just sort of this general artificial slowing scenario, which is a 50% reduction from the low scenario. We're replacing it with Bloomberg's forecast, which was recently updated. And it actually, I was just looking at it today, it looks really similar to that 50% reduction. So that is where we're headed with our EV demand forecast. So with that, I will pause and turn it back to you, Madam Chair.
All right, thanks. Interesting information. Does anyone have any questions right off the bat? Patrick?
Yeah, I do. Thanks, Siri. Going back to that graph, I guess second time I've heard this information. Do you have a sense of that red line? Like, is there any sense or any ballpark of how flat that's going to be, or is it just sort of we'll wait and see? And I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Is your question how close do I think this scenario will reflect reality, or what will the line look like when we add the Bloomberg numbers?
What will the line look like?
Yeah, so when we add the Bloomberg forecast instead, it's going to look very similar.
Oh, okay. Okay, thank you. Curious, thank you.
Yeah, I will just add, I know this wasn't exactly your question, but I think that in reality, we will actually be somewhere between the Bloomberg forecast, which is going to look very much like this, and the low scenario, because what we're expecting is that in the next couple of years, there will potentially be a little bit of a slowdown in EV adoption as we see the impacts of these federal policies. Right now, today, we're actually seeing an increase in EV adoption because people are trying to take advantage of the federal incentives before they all go away. But maybe next year, we could see a little bit of an EV adoption slowdown. Over time, though, by 2040, 2050, I would be very surprised if we're in a similar spot to where we are today, just thinking back to how EV adoption has changed over the last decade, kind of under different federal administrations. So I don't know that I wouldn't necessarily expect that red line, which will be the Bloomberg forecast, to reflect reality. I think it's a little conservative.
Okay, thank you. That was sort of the unspoken part of my question that I was going to circle back to, but you just answered it. So thank you. The question is going to be, you just answered it. Never mind. Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks. Any other questions from the committee?
I have one, Madam Chair.
Yes. Is that
okay? Yep.
Go ahead.
Hi, Siri. I don't know what slide it's on. It's earlier, and it was like a matrix of the charging stations, whether they're at multifamilies or at your house or on the street, or this one here. It seems to me one of the, I guess, rows that might be missing is who owns it. Like in residential charging, obviously it's privately owned. Community charging is probably publicly owned. Destination would be private. You know what I mean? Like, it seems to me that's an important factor to pay attention to, is who's going to pay for these things and maintain these things.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. And the scope of this analysis is focused on publicly accessible charging. So I think the assumption will be that a lot of publicly accessible charging will actually be privately owned. And then I guess depends on how you categorize things that are funded federally, owned by or sort of managed by a public sponsor, but then have private engagement. Because I will just say what we've seen in the states that we work with on the NEVI funding, which is federal, is that typically chargers are managed by a private company, just because of the sort of specificity of the EV charging technology, and the complexities that go along with managing it. It hasn't been something that we see a lot of public entities interested in managing long term. There's a lot of contracting out to third parties.
Got it. That makes some sense. In my mind, I think that at some point in the future, if this becomes, commonplace, cities are going to start wanting to own and manage their own systems as opposed to having vendors. I think eventually, but you're right away, they don't want to. But just thinking way into the future, I would guess more cities will end up owning and managing public systems like on the streets and this, that, the other. Thank you.
There's real future potential revenue stream here, I think. Is that kind of where you were going with that, or?
Yeah, right. Yep.
Yeah, I see that too. Thanks.
Yeah. And I would add, in our early engagement efforts, we have heard interest in owning stations from counties in the Twin Cities and cities as well. So I think there's definitely that desire here, specifically in the Twin Cities.
I have a question, and I think you touched on it in the beginning, but the primary use, the results of the study, primarily used, Tony, I think you mentioned regional solicitation. Now that's going to be a category. Will this be incorporated into any of the comprehensive planning activities or guidance provided to cities that are coming up? Or how broadly is this going to be used?
Chair, so I think primarily it was intended to prioritize funding and especially our funding through the regional solicitation and the charging filling infrastructure grant. And then with the hope that maybe it'd be useful to utilities to prioritize some funding for charging stations or local governments. So for comprehensive planning, we are definitely providing technical assistance under that umbrella. And we are supporting a strategy to address climate change of electrification. And so I think, it definitely fits in that context.
I don't have a lot of knowledge in this particular area, but it seems like, especially when you're talking about community charging in multifamily locations, that has a direct tie to land use decisions. And I don't know if cities, those of you that work for cities, if you're seeing any interplay there with development approvals or any incentives that cities offer for that type of thing. But it seems like it's a tool in the toolbox, perhaps. Any other questions or comments? Joe.
Yeah, Chair Mirko, just as you noted, the comp plan requirements, we won't be requiring any sort of EV discussion or considerations in comp plans, but we'll be encouraging them. And I think, resources like this, we'll be gathering resources like this and hopefully sharing them with communities to, ensure that if they do want to, discuss these kind of things, update policies regarding EV charging, that, the resources will be available for them. So yeah, appreciate that comment.
Thanks. All right, I'm not seeing much else. I do appreciate the strategies, or the second to the last slide where you did identify how this fits with the TPP goals. I think that's very helpful breakdown and an overall interesting presentation. So thanks for coming.
Yep, thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Chair.
Thanks. And with that, going back to the agenda here, that was the last information item. Does anyone have any other business or announcements for the committee? Okay, seeing none. Thank you all for your participation today. We'll get you all out of here in under an hour, and we will see you next month. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.